Well, I had a plan for tonight that I wanted to try something a new spin on the same idea. And so that the handouts from the back, if you didn't get one, Josiah, would you go be able to hand them out if somebody needs a handout? So raise your hand if you need a handout from Josiah. Okay, we got at least a couple there. We're going to be looking at the subject of pride, but we're going to be using as our jumping off point the sermon from Sunday, which was the pride in the fellowship, in the ministry of the 12. So open to Mark chapter 9. I want to introduce our lesson tonight. And again, and we can have a family discussion, whether we want to break up into two small groups, or if you can promise to interact with me, we can stay as one larger small group that I will direct. So we can get to that point, but I want to make sure that we're going to be as involved as we'd normally be if we're breaking up into small groups. The text that we looked at on Sunday is in Mark chapter 9, verse 33. Starting, it says this: They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he began to question them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent. For on the way they were discussing with one another which of them was the greatest. Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone wants to be first, he should be last of all and servant of all." Taking a child, he set him before them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me does not receive me, but him who sent me." And the point, one of the thrusts of this lesson that Jesus gives to us is that in response to the pride and the self-promotion of the disciples that they were trying to bandy about themselves, the response to that is to be that the leaders, that those who would be the great servants in the kingdom would be the servants of all, including of the lowest of the low rungs, which is the children. Again, children are beloved and treasured individually and in the family, but socially they were the lowest rung of the social ladder. And so Jesus was dealing with the pride of his disciples in wanting to be self-promoting. And we showed that this was not uncommon. It was common in the Jewish religious circles. It was common in secular circles back then. It's common today. It's a common problem. And so what I wanted to do tonight was to talk about pride, because as we talked, one of the responses, even in the discipleship, in the disciples group, was when there was this kind of jockeying for position. I believe it's is it Mark chapter 10, later on, the disciples, after James and John put themselves forward, the rest of them begin to feel indignant towards James and John. That it destroys fellowship and unity. So I want to look at the issue of pride. I'm going to do that with a series of questions and discussion. But ultimately, before we get to that, let's see if we can get an idea of what pride is. So if you were to try to describe sinful pride, how would you describe sinful pride? Because the Bible does talk about pride in two different ways. There is a proper pride, essentially a good esteeming of things in a proper way. The Lord talks about how Jerusalem will be, the pride of the nations, essentially, in Isaiah chapter 60. A couple places, but mostly pride is talked about in a negative way, a negative connotation. So if we're talking about pride, how can we describe that so we understand it? Noah, what's your thought on that?
Being so impressed by your work that you say, "How could God have done this? It was all me. God is not real."
Okay, you are impressed by your own greatness and claiming credit for what is not yours. Okay. Anybody else? Thoughts on how to describe pride, sinful pride?
It kind of says the same thing with self-exaltation.
Yeah, self-exaltation. Okay, good. Stephanie?
I was going to say the same thing, just making much of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, you're taking God completely out of the context. Any other thoughts? These are all good. These are all right on target, right over the target. Noah, one more?
Thinking you're so righteous that you can't do sin, so proud of your own good works that you can't.
Yeah, it's a puffed up. Yeah, it's a pride, particularly in the sinful sense, is an improper or excessive self-esteem, like conceit or arrogance. It's that kind of improper, excessive, wrong-placed self-exaltation, self-esteem, self-conceit, this arrogance. It's an attitude of the heart and spirit that then is manifested in the way you act. I mean, you can think of prideful actions in various contexts. We'll talk about some of those or think about some of those tonight. But pride is an issue of the heart. It's a lofty, a self-loftiness greater than where one ought to be. Again, another resource, I think this was brought up too, a proud person, someone who has pride, points to someone who shifts the ultimate confidence from God to self. So taking God out of it, pointing to yourself and not to God. It's an arrogant self-exaltation. Again, I think these are all synonyms and similar ways of what you guys had answered. So it's a good grasp on what pride is.
I think it's also important to, you kind of said it, that the relationship with God is kind of the crux of it. You know, even in Deuteronomy it says, when you become proud, then you forget me, is what God says.
Mm-hmm.
So you're usurping God's rightful place, His authority, His provision, everything. You're taking it to yourself.
Right.
Usurping that from God.
100%. And I think that whether it's Deuteronomy or in Proverbs chapter 30, where that idea of when you have too much or you take credit for what you have, you forget to give God the credit, and then you bring disrepute upon him because you have displaced him. Yeah, exactly. It's 100% correct there. And pride, as it's particularly when it comes to the jockeying for position, social or relational position. And this is not only, you can see this in friendship groups, you can see this in family groups. You want to be the favorite uncle or the favorite cousin or the whatever it might be, or the favorite grandparent, or what. You can have these kinds of inclinations to jockey for position. And wherever that happens, that serves to cause dissension. It causes strife. And it does nothing. It serves to destroy unity because little factions begin to get built up. I referenced on Sunday 1 Corinthians chapter 1, how in the church, people, because of their sinfulness, but also because of the culture in Corinth, you could make a name for yourself. Like today, you could, if you have a YouTube channel or a podcast, you can make a name for yourself by attracting people to follow after you. And that's why people were saying, well, I'm of Paul or I'm of Apollos, because there are these different groups that were trying to get ahead of others and be recognized as significant, important, whatever. And that serves to destroy unity. So you guys okay with staying in the big group and talking here? Is this good? We're good? All right, we'll do this. As we kind of begin here, I want to have two volunteers read two different proverbs that say very similar things. I want someone to volunteer to read Proverbs 16, verse 18, and someone else to volunteer to read Proverbs 18, verse 12. Any volunteers to do that? Stephanie, would you read 16, 18? And then Warren, would you read Proverbs 18, verse 12, please?
Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling.
Okay. So before we move on from that, pride goes before destruction, and haughty spirit before stumbling. Again, this is setting out in the general principles of life and wisdom. the end of pride, though it looks, it starts off good. The haughty spirit looks good at the beginning, at least in a sinfully appealing way, but it ends in destruction. So, okay, good. Warren, Proverbs 18:12.
Before destruction, the heart of man is hot, but humility walks before honor.
Okay, we have an important contrast here between haughtiness and humility as the starting points. Haughtiness again leads to destruction. The haughty of heart leads to destruction, and humility goes for honor. Again, so we see these two different paths. And I just wanted to remind us of these probably commonly remembered verses or principles. Probably the first one we read was one that probably most of us have heard many times. But it is proverbially true of the destructive nature of pride in all the areas of life. And so it's just important as we think about these things and we think about some of these questions that we're looking at, to remember how destructive pride is, and that pride ultimately, what we'll look at here, we need to be careful to nip it in the bud as we see it even in our lives as Christians. So turn back, if you're not still there, to Mark chapter 9. We'll have our first question from Mark chapter 9, and I already read the text. So the question I have in your handouts there, in this passage, again, what I just summarized for us, we're told the disciples argued about who was first among them. And now, while we don't know the criteria they may have used, we guessed, right? Some ideas potentially. But thinking about that, what are some things that Christians today can use or misuse in a prideful attempt to make much of ourselves, particularly when it comes to in the church, in the fellowship? What are some things, whether it's attitudes or actions, and I've listed a few examples there, how much you volunteer more than somebody else, or how much money you give more than somebody else, or how much more of the Bible you might know than somebody else. What are some things that either you might be tempted to do, or you've seen, or you could imagine can be ways or things that can be or have been misused to bring about, or to as an example of people putting themselves forward as being greater or jockeying for position inside of churches and fellowships? Noah, you've got an idea.
What type of sins we might struggle with? This person struggles with this sin. I don't, which means I'm better than that person.
Okay, that's a really good one. A sin haughtiness. I'm too. That's a really good one, Noah. I wouldn't struggle with that sin. Oh boy, that's a real. I think that could really. And I bet you that's probably more common. That's probably a pretty common one, actually. It's one I didn't think of. That's really good. A pridefulness about the sins that we struggle with. Isn't that kind of funny when you think about it? But it rings true, at least in my in thinking through things. That was really good. Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
It brings on a spirit of judgment.
Okay.
Being extra critical or judging.
Okay. Yeah, so whether it's whatever you're using to prop yourself up, whether it's like what Noah said or some of the examples I gave, it can result in this condescending judgmentalism of, well, I'm better than that. It's almost like the Pharisee who says, Lord, I thank you that I'm not tax, whatever else, or like this tax collector. But I paid, I tithe of all that I get, and and now, in one sense, is it right to thank the Lord that Lord, thank you that I'm not currently struggling in this area. Is that a proper thing to thank the Lord for? I think it is. To have a proper, Lord, I'm like, okay, so with a lot of young, particularly men and boys, but actually it's all over with girls too now. But I mean, ultimately, one of the big things that a lot of young people, a lot of people in general deal with is like lust in the form of looking at things and watching things they shouldn't look at, right? Now, when somebody conquers that, appreciate that input there, Paul. That was great. But when someone conquers that or deals with that, and so it's no longer a crippling, debilitating present sin, it is right to then say, Lord, thank you for bringing me out of that, that it's no longer an ever-present struggle in that area. That's proper, but what can happen with pride is, well, I don't struggle with that. You know, that, and I think we have to be careful of that. That's good. What are some other examples of maybe whether it's sins or even virtues that can give rise to this jockeying for position, or even in your own mind of not officially on like a depth chart of whatever in the church, but like I got this. The church is lucky to have me as a member here. I tell you what, you know, or whatever it might be. What are some things that could be misused in that way? I've been here at this church for 20 years, 30 years, founding member, you know. There's nothing wrong with it, but that can be a source of pride. I was here back when we were in a milk carton or whatever it might be, you know, whatever. I mean, meeting in a cardboard box on Main Street or whatever, you know, whatever, you know, not this church, but in general, that kind of an attitude can be a prideful thing. So there's a lot of things. And like I mentioned, you know, whether it's Bible knowledge, which is we ought to strive to grow in our knowledge, in what we understand, the scriptures that we know, our familiarity with the Bible. We ought to strive to grow in these areas, but all those things we have to be careful that just like we can sinfully be prideful that we don't sin in a certain area, we can be sinfully prideful of knowing doctrine, knowing the Bible, knowing Bible verses, whatever it might be. We have to watch out for ourselves. And I think that's kind of the main thrust is, you know, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, you know, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. We need to be careful, because pride is an ugly thing that creeps up on us. Now turn back a little bit to Mark chapter 7. I want to have a volunteer read verses 21 to 23. We can, we'll read verses. Actually, we'll start in verse 20. If someone wants to read verse 20 to 23. Thank you, Lauren.
And he was saying, that which proceeds out of a man, that is what defiles the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things proceed from within and defile the man.
Okay. So, first question here, from where do these prideful actions that we're talking about in general, but among other things, from where do they originate? This is the easy question of the group here. From where does pride originate? This is now for maybe a non-adult here, someone who's younger, who's not a legal adult. Someone's Isaiah. The heart. And we learn that from, well, verse 21. Pride comes out of the heart, not your blood pumping organ, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the very center of who you are, your mind, your heart, your inner soul. And so the question then is, we know that it comes from who you are on the inside. Why is that important to remember? Particularly if you see prideful activities, either in yourself or in someone else, why is it important to remember where it originates? Why would that be important? Noah?
So you're not just treating the symptoms, but actually trying to real disease.
Yeah. it's not wrong to deal with to try to stop a prideful activity, but if that's all you're doing, you're cutting the head off the dandelion. It looks good for a day, maybe two, but boy, they come back with a vengeance. And or maybe it's better. Like, okay, I'm going with my dandelion analogy. I just started it. Instead of cutting, it's like blowing the little white things off the dandelion. You know, you can look. It's all gone. Yes, for now. It's going to root up in all kinds of places very soon. So yeah, just if you remembering that it begins in the heart. It's a heart issue that has tentacles that come out in various areas, but ultimately it's an issue of the heart. So also in this text, question B, what does pride do to the one who is prideful? What does it do? We saw it in the text here. What does pride do to the one who is prideful? Destroy you? Somebody else who hasn't answered? Otherwise, we'll go to a repeat answerer. You answered before? You've answered. Marianne. It defiles you. It defiles you. It makes you unclean. It's the picture of anything from, kind of a ritual uncleanness to a very dirty unholiness. It defiles the person. And the unholiness is really the main picture, I think, there. It defiles the person. Because when it comes to the issues of cleanliness that, again, the Pharisees were concerned with, they were concerned with ritual washing so as to be clean, but it's that in the heart that actually defiles. So, similar to what we talked about before, I was talking about specific church stuff, but letter C here, what are some areas of life where pride shows up, and how does it show up? In other words, what are some areas of life where pride shows up, and what do people do that reveals that pride? Noah, what's one area of life?
It really can be anything. I mean, at work, I'm doing a good job. I might be prideful and say, hey, look at this. Look at this. I did this. Look how good that is.
Okay, so you can be prideful at work, which is not a saying I did a good job and I'm happy with it, because that's a proper esteeming of work, but a look at me, right? What are some other ways and areas in life where pride can show up and kind of how it shows up? Like, what are some of the ways that we see it? Stephanie?
Man, I was first in the neighborhood to mow that lawn down. I mean, it's silly, ours is all dandelion, but it's just one of those areas that I think we can.
We grow the dandelions for my sermon illustrations, sweetheart. We have to do that.
As long as it's green, nobody cares.
Yeah. But go ahead, sorry.
I mean, just what we accomplish out in the yard that everyone sees can easily make us feel like, oh, aren't we something?
I got the best yard in the neighborhood, or I got the nice. We want to keep a nice yard for a lot of reasons, all kinds of good reasons. To be good stewards of what God's given to us and to all the things. Those are all good reasons, but it can be like, we're first, or whatever else. You got to be, okay, good. Pride in the lawn, all right?
I go a little different when it says areas of life. You've heard the phrase thought, words, and deeds. Well, all those are addressed in this passage here.
Mm-hmm.
As pride manifests itself in our thought, in our words, and in our deeds.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the area of life that it shows up.
In my thought, word, and deed. That's right. It shows up everywhere. In every kind of possible avenue. Mine, because I was watching the NBA playoffs a little bit, or at least following them, thinking about sports. If you watch sports, whether it's the home run hit, or it's the touchdown scored, or the dunk, it's the guy goes and he does this, look at this, and just he celebrates over his vanquished opponent, because he or she, whatever, look at me, it's all about me. I mean, I didn't have a lot of end zone experience when I was younger playing sports, but I remember the statement that I think is good for people to think about is when you get there, act like you've been there before. that you know, don't show your pridefulness there. But so yes, every area of life, and it can manifest in what you say, how you speak of yourself, what you do, but also if no one else sees it, you can just be right up here. And in some ways, that is the most just destructive pride, because no one sees it right, or it takes a lot longer for it to come through. Where you let pride take residence in your mind. It's going to come out eventually, but if you give it if you water it and cultivate it in your mind, it's going to be hard to destroy it. So that was good. So going along with those answers, what are some ways that Christians can be proactive in fighting against pride before we act or speak in pride? So let's imagine that whether we've got prideful activities we're doing that are out there, but even if we notice that there's pride welling up in our hearts, or that we're giving pride residency in our minds, what are some things that we can proactively do to combat pride, to use the language of John Owen, to mortify it, to put it to death, so that it doesn't grow out and be all a bunch of nasty weeds? Noah.
That's also and everything. Thanks. So I just made this really cool thing. Thank you, God, for giving me the ability to make this. Thank you, God, for allowing me to have working hands.
Okay.
All back to God.
So thankfulness. Okay. Stephanie?
Every morning, today is a new opportunity for me to be thankful in some way. Lord, you give me breath. Help me to honor you with my thoughts and my words and my deeds.
Okay. Every day is a reset to the scorecard is graciously zeroed out, maybe, or in prideful sense, it's zeroed out. We're starting from scratch again, but it's reset. Okay, good. Anybody else?
I'll say acknowledgement of God, kind of the same theme, but in 1 Corinthians it says, what do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? Just acknowledging that really, kind of what Noel said, everything we have, we didn't deserve, we didn't really do it. We have to acknowledge God.
Yeah, and I think thankfulness is a particular action that is connected to and directly related to acknowledging God. But I was going to say, just exalting God and esteeming Him as great, as wise, as powerful, esteeming Him as being the greatest. So it's connected to both acknowledging all that I have is given from God, and I should be thankful, but also it's an esteeming of God as the greatest, and that keeps me and everything in perspective of the greatest. And if I know my heart better than anybody else but God, and He knows it way better, and I know how rancid a beast my own heart can be, that should help keep that pride down. Not that I think that everyone else has achieved a greater level, they've passed all the struggles that I have, but I know how bad I am. And the sinful proclivities and struggles that I have. So esteeming God helps remind me of keep me in my place, I guess, is kind of what I'm thinking. Any other thoughts? Let's turn over to Psalm 10. And then can I get someone to read verses 3 and 4 for us? Noah, would you read verses 3 and 4? But let's give it a minute here while people are still turning pages. Psalm 10, verses 3 and 4. Go ahead, Noah, when you're ready.
For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire, and the greedy man curses at his burning reward. The wicked, in the haughtiness of his countenance, does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no Lord.
Okay. These verses speak about sinful attitudes, including pride. How are these verses helpful in identifying pride as it develops in your own heart? In other words, what do we see here kind of that's kind of brought out when it talks about this subject of pride to help us maybe identify it in certain ways? How is this helpful in identifying pride? Marianne.
including the Lord.
Okay. What do you mean by that? Go bring that a little bit.
Well, the things that you do, the things that you're thinking of, when you bring God into it, instead of, just things that you with me, what I do, who I am, when you bring Him into it, glory goes to Him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He has done it. It just takes that feeding of it.
Yeah, good. Good. Anybody else? Stephanie.
The wicked is boasting, and he's doing kind of the opposite of what God would want. So the godly person ought to be continually seeking that thing, those things which God desires, and the only way to do that is by reading His Word and knowing what it is that He has for us.
Yeah, I think there's a significant key there between the pridefulness and the path of the proud. We'll look at that, I think, again too here, maybe in the next few verses too. But there's that definite direction setting where the person does not seek the Lord in verse 4. And so just thinking about pride is, in a real sense, I think, if I know that in an area of life or a leisure activity or some kind of a thing where I'm intentionally not trying to think about would this please God, essentially. That could be an area of where I'm pridefully putting my own desire for whatever it is above the things of the Lord. And that's, again, an example of pride. Again, where you're trying not to think about God. Again, the opposite of what Marianne said is because she's bringing Him in will help to settle this right. But the wicked is one who doesn't do that, who tries to not do that, and all of his thoughts are there is no God, and he's pushing God away. So, I think one of what I was kind of trying to get at, and you guys tell me if this makes sense, is that one of the ways that we can kind of identify, again, pride in general. There's all kinds of things we identify, but if I am walking and doing my own thing, apart from listening and heeding biblical wisdom, that evidences a pridefulness. Because I'm choosing to do the thing that I want to do and spurning the things, or even maybe just trying to not consider those things because I really want to do this. Does that make sense? Is that? I mean, I think it's helpful for me anyway. What I'm choosing to try to put in whatever sphere of life, whatever situation it might be, that yes, it's sinful and it's an example of my pride when I'm trying to just tunnel vision and just do this because it'll be enjoyable. It might be something as mundane as watching a woodworking video. Do I want to consider this, whether or not this is glorifying, this is the right way to honor God with my time at 6 o'clock in the evening or 9 o'clock, whatever it might be? if I don't even want to consider that, that's a prideful attitude, even if the action itself is not wrong. It's a prideful attitude that I think it has to be looked at. Any other thoughts from Psalm 10 there? Just look again, trying to glean some wisdom in these verses before we move on to the next section. Stephanie.
You know, I just think about our heart, the wicked boast of his heart's desire. We just need to be ever so watchful because our heart is so deceitful.
Mm-hmm.
The desires that we have to submit those ultimately first, you know, as that's seated right there in things that we think.
Mm-hmm.
Submit those right away to the Lord to see if that is.
Yeah. And because, again, like as we've already looked at tonight, that pride originates here. I mean, even James talks about we are tempted because those things out there resonate with what's already going on in here. That's what temptation does. Temptation isn't like I've never considered something and all of a sudden I'm just roped right into it. There's a seedbed of something that kind of, there's an echo of recognition, and that's when temptation takes root and goes. It's not saying that certain areas and temptations can't be awakened anew, but the issue is there's already a place for that to kind of find root and residence in your heart because of the things that originate there. I want someone to turn to Nehemiah 9, chapter 16, and someone else to read Psalm 119, verses 21 and 22. So can I have a volunteer to read Psalm 119, 21 and 22? Anyone? Marianne will read that. Okay. And can I get a volunteer to read Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 16? Oh, good. Stephanie, I was going to volunteer myself, so okay. Is that the verse I wanted from Psalm 119? Let me just look. I've got it copied in my notes there. And what's that? I have 121 listed in there, but did I mean it to be? I wanted it to be just 21 and 22, not 121 and 21. I think it was, yeah, it's 21 and 22. I can see that in my notes, actually. So it's not so it's Psalm 119, 21 and 22. That makes more sense in my mind. And then Nehemiah, I'm going to double check my Nehemiah reference too now because, yeah, okay, there we go. So we're good. We're good. We're saved here. All right, so Marianne, would you please read Psalm 119, verses 21 and 22?
You rebuke the arrogant, the cursed, wander from your commandments. Take away reproach and contempt from me, for I observe your testimonies.
And Stephanie, would you go ahead and read Nehemiah 9:16 for us?
But they, our fathers, acted arrogantly. They became stubborn and would not listen to your commandments.
Okay, so we have the Nehemiah passage buttresses what we read in Psalm 119. And so one of the questions here, well, I just to see it with an observation, the arrogant are those who wander away from the commandments of the Lord. So the question here is, why do you think that those who wander away and forsake God's commandments are referred to as arrogant? Why? So let's go with one of the younger people here, one of the non-legal adults here, who's not answered. So it takes out Isaiah, although I'm sure he had an answer. So I'm looking at right here and back there. So I'm doing this kind of thing with my eyes. So here's a question for you guys. Why do you think that those who wander from God's commandments are referred to as being arrogant? What are your thoughts? I got a lot of water to drink here, so you're not going to wait me out. Mariah. They think they're too good to follow somebody's rules. Good answer. Okay. Somebody else, still under the age of legal adulthood. Why would someone who wanders from God's commandments, doesn't follow them, be referred to as arrogant? Is it too good for God? Okay. How about they think their ways are better in general? They just think their ways are better. Well, I mean, sure it says that, but I mean, they didn't have iPhones and things back then. They didn't have all the deals that we have now, and or whatever. There's an arrogance to think that we know better, that you might know better. And that can lead to wandering from God's commands. So, this may is a little bit of a repeat of a question. What?
Well, I was just thinking about, I raised my hand, I was thinking about how.
Do you think you're under the legal age of adulthood, young lady?
I just had a thought.
Well, okay then, I guess we'll allow it.
How prone we are to wander. How easy it is, in little small ways, to not even realize that our heart has wandered from God's commandments. And so, as we read, and just before that, how can a young man keep his way pure by keeping it in accordance with your word? We need to continually seek after and treasure God's commandments so that we might not sin.
And ultimately, the reason we seek after God's commandments is because, or to obey them, is we want to know and please our God. Because our God is the one who is good and does good. And so a desire to know him and to obey him and to please him is related to doing those things that are good, even if we don't think they make sense in good, and depending on our age and stage of life. So what are some areas, specific things maybe, where Christians in our culture can easily begin to wander away from following God's commands and instead follow after the things that people around us do? So what are some things that, as Christians who live in this time and this place, what are some things that we maybe, because the water's been turned up temperature slowly over time, where that frog, we don't realize that we're wandering after things of the world rather than following after God's commands? What are some areas that might be, we might be prone to do that? Yeah.
Just to backtrack just for half a second. Does arrogant also mean that your heart is hardened and you don't hear God anymore?
Well, the disciples were called hard-hearted, so I wouldn't say arrogance would have that kind of stubbornness.
It's a little deeper. It's a little.
I think so. I mean, I think that's fair. It's not like like those who are the arrogant or the cursed, as the psalmist says. That's categorically speaking of people who are, like John would say in 1 John, their life is described as walking in darkness. They are not of the light. So that there's categorical statements of the arrogant, the cursed, the walking in darkness. But there are places where you can be stubborn and hard-hearted. The disciples were stubborn and hard-hearted to listen to all that Jesus was teaching at different times, and so can we be. So there is this arrogance where you're going to have this kind of calloused over, I don't want to hear it. So yes, that is part of it. And that's a hard thing because, it's a hard thing to recognize sometimes, but that is part of it. So with that kind of, additional detail, what are some of the areas where, when it comes to us in our culture, in our time, or Christians, those of us who'd gather on a Wednesday night Bible study, might be prone to wander from following God's commands, even unintentionally, but following the things of the people around us that are okay, not that bad, or whatever, or acceptable, or whatever else? What are some things that we might be prone to do? Stephanie.
Laughing at things we ought not to laugh about.
Okay.
Nobody likes to be that one who calls out the whatever it is that's not funny.
Okay. So trying to keep a rein on our sense of humor, or what we training ourselves that we ought not to laugh at some things, maybe. Okay. Guilty. Noah.
Well, in our current culture, all this kind of sexual morality stuff, the spousal prohibition on relations before marriage, the culture nowadays is, oh, you gotta listen out because you don't know if you like it when you get married, or all this other
Mhm.
stuff. Or it doesn't mean anything if you just want all this stuff.
Yeah.
With the way the culture's pushing everyone towards that kind of belief, it can turn people away from it.
That's right. There's a even in Christian ideas of kind of lax sexual morality. Actually, one of the things in this that I find to be most troubling about kind of a resurgence of popularized Christianity, at least there's for a while, like even in like political and other kinds of circles, people didn't talk about Christianity much, which is lamentable. But the lamentable thing now is there's a lot of people out there who are popularizing in their own little spheres of political and all kinds of commentary, talking about their Christian values, but they're not Christian. They will say they're Christians, but also then talk about all kinds of vile things and kind of wink and nod at sexual immorality. And I think there's a danger in that kind of that poisoning of the water. So Noah's point, I think, is dead on. That there's that. Well, my friends who go to youth group, or my friends who are at church, a lot of them have done these same things. And they're Christians, right? So I mean, I'm sure it's not great, but I mean, is it really that bad? I've told a story before where when I was working at McDonald's as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, maybe I was 16 at the time. I was working with a girl who was older than me, and she was going to a church in town and was telling about how she was excited to do things that she ought not to do with her boyfriend. And she's like, I can just ask for forgiveness later. I mean, that's the kind of this deadening. So we have sexual immorality, we've got humor, any other areas that, again, we, Bible study, midweek attending people, will go to a Sunday school class, will go to church regularly, who are serious about the Bible and serious about following the Lord. What are some areas that we can be prone to, particularly if we're not careful, follow after the things of the culture rather than following after the commands of the Lord? Any other areas? Noah, you're next, and then Stephanie.
Well, it's not the exact same, but almost regarding politics, it's more important than religion.
Yeah.
I know for me, I really like politics. I like looking at politics, seeing national stuff. But I know for some people, they view politics as more important than their religion, or politics as their religion.
Yeah, that's true. That crossing of lines or blurring of categories. Yeah, that's true. Good. Stephanie?
And I was thinking about a similar tying it in. The world grumbles and complains about the economy and the politics and anything that we can grumble and complain about. And it's very easy to get caught into that sweep of grumbling and complaining rather than being thankful and recognizing that God has ordained everything at its proper time for His glory, for our good, for His purpose.
That's right, and that's a great spin on the same thing of what the resulting focus on some of those things can be if we're not careful. The one that I was thinking of that no one's going to like, including me, that I'm going to say it, is the music that we choose to listen to, that even subtly, or not so subtly, maybe subtly in our minds, but maybe not so subtly, is abhorrent to God. The video games we play that maybe subtly or not so subtly encourage, whether it's wickedness on the screen or a wicked kind of alienation from the real world and not being with the people that I'm around, or the comedies or the dramas, the shows that we watch that are subtly or not too bad. I'm telling you, I don't like this one at all, but this is an area where I think we are so prone to compromise, and I think we have to be very careful about it. And it doesn't mean that I don't have the exact right answer for all the things, but boy, if we don't ask those questions of, is my YouTube watching glorifying to God? Is my video game playing, or is it somehow helping me to walk away or not follow God's commands, either to take care of my family, to love my siblings, to whatever it might be? I mean, is it am I even considering that question? Is the music I'm listening to, am I even considering if it is honoring to the Lord with my time and my mind? I think we have to be very careful that we don't mindlessly walk into things just because they're there and they're not as bad as they could be. I'm telling you, I don't like this about application question either. But I think it's important that we need to consider, because these are the areas that probably we could at least begin to take ownership of and make little godly improvements in. So, well, let me close with prayer as our time is up tonight. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for our time that we can discuss that which is prideful, and how do we understand pride and how it takes root in our hearts, and that we, Lord, need to be vigilant so that it doesn't take root and manifest in our thoughts, words, and deeds. That we not forget you or forget your goodness so as to wander in a haughty way away from what you've commanded. Lord, help us to take this to heart, and not that we'll have perfect application of this lesson in general, or of any lesson. May we strive to be molded increasingly in all of our areas of life into looking more like Christ. In his name we pray.